All right, so welcome. This next session with our colleague from Indiana University, Indianapolis, is on ePortfolios as a high impact practice in undergraduate education, evidence from a pre-post intervention study. I'm going to go ahead and let you introduce yourself, but I'm super excited to learn from you, given our shared interest, my interest also in entrepreneurship and venture education. So would love to hear about how you're using ePortfolios in this context. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Hey, hello everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to present and share some ideas and thoughts. Some of the things that I'm presenting is a kind of started with Debbie here, and thank you, Debbie, for making me uh, first think about the use of ePortfolio in my classes, and second to reflect, right? We just have a section on reflection. And I think I have been for the past year reflecting a lot on learning and teaching methods and high impact practices. It's been challenging, I think, to me since AI and the new generations about to engage more students in the process and how to make them better professionals and students and get the most they can from our classes, right? So I think that these challenges are shared by you and listen to you, and what's happening in the higher education today is super challenging. And let's see. So this presentation started with one of my reflections with Debbie about how to engage the students in the using ePortfolio. And one of our conversations, not only between us, but also with other professors here at IU, one of the questions I had at that time was that different students from different disciplines might have different outcomes using those methodologies, right? And one of these questions started coming up with because these conversations were across disciplines. I am from business school, and professors from arts and other more, how can I say, hands-on type of methodologies of learning. And I had a student from the art department in my class last semester, and I saw her doing so well that my assumption, based on an anecdote of one student, right, was that students with prior experience in ePortfolios or coming from disciplines that are more engaged in hands-on type of, more visual methods and so on, would have a better learning outcomes than people from business or accounting or areas that are more analytical and not as much visual, or that requires some sort of um, web experience and so on. So this conversation started popping up, but I didn't have the data, right? So I was teaching a small class of entrepreneurial students, a new venture creation class of one of our certificates here at Cali School of Business with like 15 students. So I didn't have enough data to test those ideas and hypotheses. And talking to Debbie and her team at the ePortfolio studio here at IU, she mentioned that she had data on different courses, right? All the faculty members who were actually trying these new methodologies in their classes, she had data on pre and post courses experiences, and she shared with me, and I told her, oh, let's see if we can find something interesting here, or at least uh, test some of these questions that I'm struggling, and let's see what the data says, right? And this is a very preliminary study and using Debbie's and her team data, and I'm going to share with you. So this is by far not ready to publish, but it's a work in progress. So any feedback from you and any thoughts or ideas are more than welcome. So I'm not trying to sell something ready here, quite the opposite. And again, any feedback will be appreciated. Okay, so let me start by sharing my screen. See my screen?
Yes,
Sorry
we
for
do.
this, okay, long introduction, because this is where these conversations came from. Okay, so the presentation is about ePortfolio as a high impact practice in undergrad education here at IU, evidence from pre and post intervention study. So this is based again on database data. So why we are studying this, looking to the literature on ePortfolio, right? There is a recent debate about whether ePortfolios could be this, quoting here, meta high impact practice that actually integrates several learning methods or high impact practices across the curriculum. And it's quite true, I think, right? It's not just academic. I feel the same when I'm embedding in ePortfolio, because again, talking to our Center of Teaching and Learning, for example, in my classes, I have several high impact practices altogether. And the ePortfolio actually in my personal class was a kind of integrative experiment, or how can I say, artifact that students have to integrate several, actually all the assignments and activities that we had in the class was based on the ePortfolio. So when I was reading this idea of meta high impact practice, actually I lived it. And I definitely agree that ePortfolio could be framed as a meta high impact practice that integrates other practices. When we look to I was doing brief literature review to see, if we have more information about the effectiveness and how other scholars are using or measuring ePortfolio as an effective high impact practice. What we observe is that when you have these studies, most of them are single courses, like what I was trying to do, but without a sample size enough, or a single discipline, right? Or either engineering or business or arts, whatever these scholars are teaching. And this is actually what's interesting of this, because we have, in this research, we have 15 courses in one semester that Debbie was actually, how can I say, Debbie? I don't know. Are you coordinating or something like that, right? I would say that.
I'm
Coordinate
supporting.
or lead.
I support.
Support. Yeah.
Yes.
And so across 11 different schools, and what we have here is 600 students were surveyed at pre-class and 500 at post-class. These numbers are after cleaning the data, right? Because when we do these surveys, they're not perfect. We all know that, data is hard to collect, and not only to collect, but cleaning. And after cleaning, those are the full responses that we are able to get, right? To run the analysis. The data, the raw data has more sample size, but those are the full answers, right? So this is what I'm calling a rare chance to test this idea of equity and disciplinary differences across courses. So let's see. I had some prior questions that I tried to test, and those are the ones that I was thinking of. So if you have other questions, that let me know. I would be happy to test later if we can. So the first one was about this idea of prior experience, right? And one of the barriers I noticed in my classes was some students either have difficulties in setting up ePortfolio as its own website, even though Debbie's team and myself were, over and over supporting, training, I mean, collaborating with students to make that as smooth as possible in a way that the learning is not based on the website that they're building, but on the artifacts that they are creating, and that the technology should be the lowest barriers possible, uh, that they're learning, and the content and the experience and the discussions and the um, reflections would be the key elements for their learning process, and the technology ideally should be as smooth as possible, right? So one of the question was, is the technology's barriers a problem here? And if it is, does it comes from their students' background or prior experience using ePortfolios in prior classes or so on? And was one of the questions that we are thinking of, whether this could be an impediment for a better high impact, right, that we expected. Another question was about this experience, right? So these students that I had and others, right? I had in my class different honors students, and here at the IU, the college, by construction, and from the beginning, all honors students, they have e-portfolios at their first year. So when they reach to me in the first or the junior or senior years, honor students by construction again already have prior experience. And one of the assumptions we had was, oh, so if they have prior experience, right, they're better off. Basically, it's not because of the learning, the e-portfolio methodology is just because they have prior experience, and those gaps, if any, it's just because of that, right? And was one of the questions. Another question was about this, what I mentioned before, the disciplinary culture of different faculties and schools. So whether this could be, again, driving the results that we observe in terms of learning and outcomes. And finally, this point of authenticity and how the ePortfolio methodology is used, not as much as whether they used, but how they are used, right? Whether, so if that makes it, the integration of the portfolio is meaningful for them, right? And the learning is not, as some of you mentioned in the prior discussion, right? Another element, another another checklist, another assignment for checking knowledge, and that was not the idea at all, right? And it is not the idea at all. So those were the questions that we were thinking of, exploring. And the data we had, as I mentioned before, is the pre and post course surveys done by the Debbie's team. So basically, each professor at the beginning of the class, they shared with us a link, right, in which students are asked to complete the survey before the class, and at the end of the class, the same. One of the problems we have in this process is that we are not tracking all the students for both, because it's anonymous survey. So it's not exactly the same students that are taking the pre and post. We don't know actually. It could be, but because we cannot know, we also cannot cross-check this results we have here with their grades or gender or other personal, demographic data that would be, super nice to have and cross-check and have a more in-depth analysis, right? So in terms of the analysis, what I did here was a multi-level model. It's just to take into account that the students are nested in courses which are nested in schools. So basically, when we are looking to the data, we are considering this, what we call these multi-level models that actually take into account this interclass correlation. This is small box here on the right-hand side. So just to correct for that, right? And by the way, this is a second version of the, just to disclaimer of the, I have been working with this since I sent this, the proposal. So just to make sure that this, at the beginning, when I submitted the proposal, I didn't correct it for this interclass correlation, but for this presentation, I updated the analysis. Okay, but the results remains the same, actually. So the first research question, what we observed is that actually there is an interesting decline on the barriers, especially in terms of time required, the technological difficulty of students overall from pre to post. So this is a good sign. In other words, that the e-portfolio as a high impact practice actually helps students to be more comfortable and familiar with the technology. So assuming that technology is an important skills for students moving forward, this is a good sign as well. In terms of comfort and professional presence, and this is interesting because one of the main claims that we had when we are presenting to the students the importance of the e-portfolio as a high impact practice is that this is not just for the class, or this is not just for their program, this is for their lives as professionals. And I remember Debbie presented several examples of former students, graduates that were, already, for example, professors in different schools, or taking a graduate program in a different university, that they still have their e-portfolio to show up not just what they did in the past, but also as a personal and professional website and a frame, to showcase their work. And what we observed is that both the comfort of students with this new technology and also the likelihood of them to use this e-portfolio as professional website increases a lot after across the board, right? Again, this is controlled by the different course schools, right, level. In terms of this idea of equalizer and the different capital or human capital experience they have prior to coming to the class, what we observe at the entry is that this is real. So in other words, there are significant barriers in terms of entry, in terms of familiarity with the e-portfolio. As I mentioned to you, especially for students that are honor students and non-honor students, but also we observe these e-portfolio familiarity differences across different domains as well. There are some schools that are use more or tend to use more ePortfolio as a tool than others. And this gap we observe at the entry, right? But we actually do not observe the same problem, let's say, or barriers at the end, at the exit of the classes, right? So when we look to the value of the ePortfolio, or we look to the skills gained afterwards, or the technology comfort, they actually equalize. So this is what our interpretation is, that the ePortfolio methodology is being helpful to equalize students, in the sense that those students that have prior experience with this methodology are not getting better off. Quite the opposite, the lower level of students actually that didn't have a prior experience are leveling up to the prior students level. So this is, I believe, it's a good signal of it cannot prove the effectiveness of the methodology or this practice, but at least there is some robust correlation here. So what I'm saying here is that this consistent with this idea of compensatory logic of high impact practices, that prior experience has a difference at the beginning, but does not have a difference at the end, right? So this is equalize students' experience and knowledge. What is interesting to observe here is those are the different schools that we have in the sample. So informatics, business, public health, liberal arts, education, arts. And so what we observe is that, for example, in terms of technology comfort, the School of Arts are the lowest at the entry, but once you look at the exit, the difference disappears, right? So this is it's very interesting for us because again, it shows that it's a matter of exposure. So the technology discomfort, or it's not that students are lagging behind, it's just that they didn't were exposed to that technology, and afterwards they simply raise their level closer to the others, right? So there is no statistical difference afterwards. And finally, this idea of doing well, quoting here is not, I mean, how authentic the portfolio is used and how the students value that. So the more authentic, again, quoting here, the more value they observe in terms of the outcome, the learning outcomes, right? So basically, we tried. I mean, for me, it was a kind of surprise. I thought that the prior experience with ePortfolio would be significant to their learning experience. So my intuition was wrong. Actually, what the data shows is quite the opposite, right? It's a leveling the playing field, and the more authentic the professor embed this practice in their classrooms, the better for the perception of students in terms of value of learning. And so that's it, basically, right? Again, those are the same ideas, so but in a kind of a summary of what we observed. In terms of contributions, we have this for research. We actually or extends or agree with this literature on the compensatory equity logic of high impact practices. What we observe is that this 11th or meta high impact practice, that is the portfolios, also observes this same effect. Not only that, but also that this is across the board, right? Across different domains, across different disciplines. For practice, again, we do observe at the beginning gaps in terms of technological gaps and prior experience with ePortfolios, but if applied correctly, I mean, ePortfolio levels up different observed levels at the beginning to the end. And finally, this idea of the authentic use of the methodology. Limitations of this, several limitations, again, this is a cross-section, repeated cross-section, so we don't know who our students are. So because of that, we cannot cross-check exactly how the high-impact practice is affecting their grades or outcomes, because we don't check over content and knowledge from grades, measured by grades or any other demographic data. Those are self-reported outcomes. Again, it's not grades. It's not. We cannot say anything about, oh, they improved learning, right? We cannot assure that because it's not measuring learning. It's measuring self-reported outcomes, right? It's how students feel about their learning outcomes. Okay. And that's it, pretty much. I mean, I thank you again for your listening, and it's open up for questions. I mean, this. Thank you.
This is fantastic, LR or Luis. I really appreciate, this presentation, especially of empirical data that that really begins to. I think this also represents sort of the evolution of the ePortfolio scholarship, and I guess maybe a question to just start us off, and others, please feel free to raise your hand, unmute, or go ahead and put in the chat. One thing I'm curious about is that this, what you found about that prior experience doesn't necessarily affect, the outcomes, that you see this as an opportunity to level the playing field. Does this imply that interventions with ePortfolios can happen anytime then? It's not necessary that it has to happen in a first or second year class, but could also be introduced sort of at a junior, senior level, for example.
Oh, yes, definitely. And this is actually my experience, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
teach junior and senior students,
Yeah.
and what I observed there, that was detrimental to my intuition, actually, right? I
Mm-hmm.
was expecting the opposite. I was
Right.
expecting quite the opposite. And what the data shows is not true. I mean, what I expecting was not true, right?
Mm-hmm.
And was surprising to me, and actually was a kind of relief, right? It's not
Right.
in the sense that I should keep doing that. I should not only that, show to the students that any potential problem they have at the beginning is
Mm-hmm.
just, at the beginning, and it's a matter of practice, right?
Right.
And if we mix this idea with the authenticity that we observed at the end as well,
Mm-hmm.
it makes more powerful. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the methodology more powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you,
I
Ellen,
mean,
for the question.
opens up all kinds of opportunities, so, and super excited also about the opportunity for a longitudinal study within subject and not versus just the cross-sectional longitudinal. So it seems like that would be great. Um, any other questions for Luis? Debbie, I know that you've been excited to see the data. Tara's been in there working. So yeah, any thoughts or
Oh, yeah.
reactions, Debbie?
We're texting back and forth, and I almost want you to turn the recording off because I don't want to be too sappy, but like I'm like teary-eyed. This is so like we work so hard, and I can't do what Louise is doing with these numbers. Um, and so I'm just ecstatic and relieved and hopeful, and this is fabulous. So thank you so much for crunching these numbers for us and helping us make sense of this big pile of data that we've been collecting.
And what are the plans for, as we wrap up, what are the plans for publication of this work?
That's a fantastic question. I have to go back to Debbie actually to see, and to you, because my
Mm-hmm.
research is, I do research in my area, right? I don't publish in
Mm-hmm.
pedagogical journals at least at this point. And I don't know really what are the best outlets out there to present these results, and what are the expectations, what are the, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
rigor they expect in terms of empirical identification, or if just correlations could be enough. I don't know. I don't know the field. I have to, I mean, I asked Debbie to help me, and Tara,
Mm-hmm.
the experts here in higher
Mm-hmm.
education, and especially in high impact practices. So moving forward, the idea is to join efforts again back to Debbie and her team to
Mm-hmm.
let me know what can we do further.
Well, very much publishable, I think, in a number of different venues. And I'll be talking a little bit about publishing ePortfolios later. You might be in bed by then, but the video will be available for you. But there are lots of places that I think that'd be very interested in your work.
And Candace works with one of them. It's the ABLE ePortfolio review. We call it AEPR. And sometimes pieces start there and then evolve and go other places as studies expand. And sometimes they stay there over time. But no, you're making us all cry. No, I mean, like, this is just so great.
Well, I
No,
can't imagine a better note than that to go ahead and I think there's also already a follow-up from Andrew with some additional ideas for where your future work might take you. But again, Luis, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, especially from a data-driven example of ePortfolio practice as well as ePortfolio impact.